Honestly, I must say, not very much happened at the Rio conference.
And I myself am a member of parliament representing the Kalahari Desert. You can see the desert is encroaching.
The problem is so simple as to be solved by the change of administration. If it were that simple, I think the United States would be a utopia by now.
We, the people's representatives, are directly accountable to the people in what we preach and in what we say and in what we do.
How often have you wondered what the politicians of the world are doing about the larger picture, the problems of the planet? The next 2 hours go some way toward answering that question. In November 1992, a first was recorded at the United Nations. For the first time in its history, a group of politicians, unencumbered by official government briefs, assembled at the UN to address some of the critical issues facing humanity today. This televised dialogue, organized by Parliamentarians for Global Action, a network of politicians from around the world, was a unique event in international affairs, and a sign perhaps of things to come. The first question concerned the environment. How can humanity combat deforestation and global warming while still ensuring a sustainable development for the impoverished countries of the South? The second concerned peace. How can the United Nations be strengthened and brought center stage in global politics so that acts of aggression, such as the Iraqi invasion, and internal conflict, as in Somalia and the former Yugoslavia, can be avoided? In addressing these key questions, the politicians sought to give real meaning to the opening phrase of the UN Charter, signed nearly 50 years ago. We the peoples, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But to date it has been the governments, represented by their diplomats, who have read out official policies to one another at the United Nations. In this dialogue, what you see are the politicians, the members of Congress and parliaments, representing some 5 million citizens of the earth. That is 1/1000th of the total population of the world, a microcosm of the world's parliaments. But it is a beginning. And in this beginning, it is the earth, not simply their own countries, that they have in mind when they speak for their people, the planetary interest, not simply the national interest they are seeking to serve. Opening the debate and welcoming the parliamentarians to the UN is Secretary General Boutros Ghali.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the United Nations. Your debate today on issues before the United Nations is an important contribution.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are at grips with realities of the everyday type, the most concrete of your electors. As such, it is up to you to consider the relations of interdependence and solidarity which link all human beings and nations. You are stages in the chain. It's for you to understand that the work of the United Nations is not remote and abstract, alien to the everyday preoccupations of ordinary people. This work affects everyone. The efforts of the United Nations for the sake of peace and social justice concern the whole of mankind. I'm expecting a great deal from you because you are the voice of the peoples you represent. And it is by addressing these words to you, it is each individual, every citizen of the earth, that through you I am seeking to reach. Because there is nothing more dangerous for a leader than to lose touch with the men and women he is working for. This specific point where we are today, the headquarters of the United Nations, from which we can stretch out to reach the most destitute among us.
Chairing the two-day session is the Honourable David MacDonald of the Canadian Parliament. Mr. MacDonald is Chairman of the Environment Committee in the Canadian House of Commons.
Welcome everyone to this unique and special occasion, as has already been indicated by the International President and the comments by the Secretary General. In the course of the next 2 days, we will be looking at two agendas. The agenda for peace, introduced earlier this year by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and Agenda 21, and in particular, several matters related to it, produced by the Earth Summit in Brazil this past June.
Today's subject concerns the problem of the planet's environment, and in particular the problems of deforestation, ozone depletion, and climate change, better known perhaps as global warming or the greenhouse effect. The discussion opens with a lament. Countries in the South, the Third World, are suffering, and indeed some developed countries too. Environmental damage is being caused, and it is not their own doing. Dr. Andres Palma, Member of Parliament from Chile.
15% of our national territory is directly affected by this lack of ozone over Antarctica. There have been changes in the genetics of the plants, the animals, and sea life, and we don't know where this will take us. It is the first time. We have had ice ages, we have had changes in temperature, but we had never intervened. We are changing our environment. We should take the responsibility and have the resources to resolve this problem. We would do nothing by saying, let us resolve the problem of environment if we are not willing to provide the resources to do so.
The Right Honourable Helen Clark. Ms. Clark was recently Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand and currently is Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
The first was to express solidarity with the colleague from Chile on raising the issue of the ozone hole, because New Zealand, like Chile, is very badly affected by this, and already we see the skin cancer melanoma as the fastest growing kind of cancer among young people in our society.
It is, and I don't want to be overly dramatic, it is quite terrifying to think that if all of the chlorine gases and the various compounds in which they're presently available in the industrialized world seep up into the atmosphere in the course of the next half century. What we have seen so far, as eloquently described by Mr. Palma, is only the beginning.
It is not only ozone depletion, but also climate change or global warming that threatens the planet, as we are told by parliamentarians from Australia and the Philippines. Australia's Gary Gibson.
The impact of climate change on Australia would be profound. The nature of the Australian environment, climate change would be expected to touch on probably almost every aspect of Australian life and economic interests. They'd include physical impacts such as beach erosion, coastal flooding. 90% of our population lives along the coastline, therefore climate change will have a major impact on that. And it'll also have major impact on changes to terrestrial and marine ecosystems within Australia. So we are very much concerned about the impact of climate change and responding positively to climate change.
Miguel Romero of the Philippines.
And when you talk of global warming, When you talk of the increase of the temperature and the increase of the rise of water level, you can imagine countries like the Philippines, which has 7,000 islands, how this will be inundated in the future.
Some, however, query the reliability of the scientific data before the international community. Bill Green of the United States Congress.
That the science is still a very moving target. Obviously, the ozone effects are well known, and everyone, I think, can agree on the need to eliminate the chlorofluorocarbons. Many of us thought until earlier this year that by eliminating chlorofluorocarbons, the CFCs, we were in fact also contributing to a solution of the global warming issue, because the polar ozone destruction reaction was an exothermic reaction which was releasing heat into the atmosphere. We then learned earlier this year that the mid-latitude ozone reaction was quite a different one, which in fact was a cooling reaction, so that net eliminating chlorofluorocarbons will have gained us nothing by way of global warming, however beneficial it is, and it is absolutely critical in terms of ozone.
Claudine Schneider, former U.S. Congresswoman and today's co-moderator.
That it's important that at least the United States scientific community is in agreement that there is in fact a trend known as global warming.
Oh, yes,
where the scientific controversy exists is on two specific points. One is that the scientists cannot concur as yet as to whether we are currently immersed in a global warming syndrome, or whether it is something that is going to start 5 years from now, or 3 years from now, or 20 years from now. And the second scientific question that exists is, are we talking about an increase in temperatures of 1 degree over the next 5 years, or will it be 3 degrees over the next 10 years? So those are the uncertainties. But I think that
I do think they go beyond that, because I really think that there is a total lack of agreement among scientists as to feedback effects, whether the additional clouds you get will be largely ice or largely not ice, and that produces two different scenarios. I think there is a good deal of disagreement as to the extent to which oceans are carbon dioxide sinks.
I think the details, there are clearly disagreements, because it is all emerging science at this time.
Yeah, exactly.
But today, as we speak, we have the benefit of 1,400 scientists from the global community who have come together under the umbrella of the Union of Concerned Scientists, who are sending a warning to humanity. They have agreed that this issue is significant enough that they are sending a message to parliamentarians saying, we cannot wait, that we have some scientific data, but we must begin preventive measures today, because we do not know how long the turnaround process will begin.
I agree with everything you've said. How much expense does one commit one's government to, one's people to, in the face of a problem which is an obvious problem, but whose scope is still not known?
Dr. Abdul Moyeen Khan from Bangladesh.
If you look from the point of view of a tiny country, Bangladesh, which is not at all contributing to the process of global warming, but nonetheless will have to take the brunt of it in case there is a few degrees of rise in the global temperature, 15% of the people could be affected by a few degrees of rise in the temperature. 20% of the land will go underwater. 16% of the housing would go underwater, and 20% of food production would be affected. That's serious enough. The point is, Bangladesh is not contributing to this process. So, who would take care of this? Bangladesh does not have the resources nor the means to take care of this.
Ozone depletion and global warming are the greatest threats to the planet's environment. One of the greatest contributors to these problems is the rate of deforestation. Since 1945, 11% of the Earth's vegetative surface has been degraded, an area larger than India and China combined. By the year 2100, 1/3 of all species now living may well be lost. But not everyone views the problem of deforestation alike.
Coming from a country where the forest cover is only 8%, the official figures, and unofficial figures going to 6%, it's difficult to talk about forestation. From the viewpoint of the developed countries, one looks upon forests as sinks for the undesirable gases, carbon dioxide, for instance. On the other hand, when we look from the point of view of developing countries, one looks upon the forests as a natural habitat for human beings. There's a big difference in these two approaches, and one has to look upon forests in its real perspective. In developed countries, forests, logging is being used for various commercial purposes, while if you think about the developing countries, people do go for deforestation, but for the simple reason of dire existence. In a country where there are no formal sources of energy, and where at the end of the day people have to put something underneath the earth to cook their food, they do go for deforestation. But then there is a great deal of difference between the two.
In Africa, the problem of deforestation is acute. The Honorable Opa Roshisha, Deputy Minister of Environment.
The question of deforestation in my country, it's really high on the agenda. Recently, we concluded a national survey where we wanted to find out how much understanding and how much value the society placed on the issue of environment. And this issue of deforestation was number one. 90% of our people thought that this issue of deforestation should receive immediate attention from government. And I wouldn't want to say that the drought situation had also an impact on the importance of deforestation, because people were able to link the drought situation and also deforestation. And we have had such immense response from women themselves after realizing that they have no alternatives at the moment of fuel wood. They have volunteered themselves to identify pieces of land where they would plant some trees on those woodlots. But of course, we have had problems to back them up financially.
The drought situation has had an even worse effect on the vegetation in neighboring Botswana. Mr. Lesedi Motabamele, Member of Parliament for the Kalahari Desert in Botswana.
My country is semi-arid, and in fact, it appears that much of the country has been turning into a desert.
Nobody lives forever. Nobody lives forever.
We in most of the parts of the country, we don't talk of any forest whatsoever. If you have to plant trees, they need water. Trees need water. We have realized that, of course, we don't have surface water. Groundwater is salty, much of it. I believe in Australia they desalinate. In Botswana, we have spoken about that. That appears to be expensive, especially for us. Maybe in Australia and those countries which are nearer, sources of implements, it may be cheaper, but for us it's expensive. Now, of course, the will is there. We would wish to see, this done, but it's difficult. As I say, we have a problem. So maybe my neighbor here will encourage the NGOs and those people who can help us. Because I believe Australia too was arid. I have said the spirit is willing, the purse is weak. Where do we go from here? Where do we go? I mean, we smaller countries that don't have funds. Where do you go to? Can you people help us?
Thus the eloquent plea from the representative of the drought-ridden African countries. But elsewhere, the problem of deforestation is of a very different order, as Miguel Romero of the Philippines describes.
As you know, we have rampant logging in our country, illegal logging, and you have placed here in the data sheet the agricultural land clearing. We call it slash and burn. You have here the fuel wood, you have logging, we call it the commercial logging, illegal logging. And you realize, and you probably read, that last year in our country, in an area called Ormoc City or Leyte, because of deforestation, thousands, if not millions of Filipinos died in a flash flood. Flood that came about in a split second, where people did not know what hit them.
And in today's world, even when there is not deforestation, problems still haunt humanity in the developed countries of the North, as Theo Meyer, an architect from Bern and a member of the Swiss Parliament, explains.
You can cut trees, but you have to replant them. And if you need to build a street or a housing project or something, you have to rebuild the same square meter somewhere else. And that's why in Switzerland we still have, after 120 years, the same percentage of wood in the whole country. Our problem today is different. We have too much timber because the forest is ill, because of too much pollution in the air, and we have great problems to bring it down to an amount that the forest can still exist. That is our problem.
Gary Gibson of Australia recalls his country's historical record on forestry.
Forest policy is a major political issue within Australia, and it's a reflection of what has happened in our country with regard to forests. In our short history of European settlement, Australia has managed to clear approximately about 70% of our native forests. And that's not something I wear as a badge of honour in no uncertain terms, because in particular we've done that at the expense of the Indigenous people of Australia at the same time, and moved most of the Indigenous people out of those areas, and they were the protectors of a lot of those forest areas. So our treatment of Indigenous people goes hand in hand with the way in which we've treated our continent and our natural resources.
Ard Melkert of the Netherlands recalls his country's record, though in a different light.
There are many good reasons why the problem of deforestation has been put on the international agenda. But still, I feel a bit unsure about the general way in which the problem is dealt with. And I think we should be careful by going into a discussion which would imply that every deforestation is a bad thing. And I have to say that also looking back to the history of my own country, because in the Middle Ages my country used to be full of forest. Even the name Holland is referring to woodland. Now we don't have many trees left, and we're a very prosperous country, and there's a relation between the two.
Mariana Granditz of Austria disagrees.
I'm still not sure if my neighbor just wanted to be the advocatus diaboli, or if he's serious, because in case he is serious, I would have to hold a lecture about history and the role of Holland and the big amount of the account that Holland has to take over in the role that Holland played in the colonial system, and how many forests have been destroyed by Holland already by that time, including their own country. Another fact is that there are strong economic lobbies in this country, including Indonesia and Malaysia, people who want simply make business. And you need for business a second part, and usually the second part is somewhere in Europe, in Japan, especially in that countries that don't have own forest reserves. So I include Holland to these countries, because I still believe that Holland needs some timber, wood nowadays as well as in the past.
Now the question has to be asked, what is to be done? How can the world come to terms with these truly horrendous problems of the environment and seek new solutions to them? Will the solutions proposed by the experts, by the governments in the negotiations, stick in terms of public opinion? This is the crucial test for the politicians, the representatives of the people, as they confront the task of finding what will be palatable to the citizenry of their countries and yet effective in overcoming the problems that they and their countries face. Opening this aspect of the discussion is the chairman, David MacDonald of Canada.
2.5 years ago, Parliamentarians for Global Action convened an important meeting of parliamentarians in Italy, in Bellagio, Italy. That meeting was an attempt to bring together not only parliamentarians from North and South and East and West, but a group of distinguished scientists to look squarely at the issue of global warming and climate change. The document that was produced at that conference is in your material, and it is, again, I think, prophetic in that it tries to indicate quite clearly the key issues that need to be addressed in this global crisis facing humanity. That we are in a period of enormous transition that can only be compared, if you like, to the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution itself. The very heavy dependency of the 20th century on industrial activity related to carbon dioxide emissions has got to end, which, while we have paid lip service to it in some countries for the past decade or so, there has not been a major attempt to use renewable forms of energy. Clearly, in all of this, there is a fundamental need to identify resources. Resources both in terms of information and expertise, and resources in terms of the financial resources necessary to make these major transitions.
Global Action's Bellagio statement, signed by 13 leading parliamentarians involved in the environment, was indeed prophetic. Its proposals were far-reaching. As Secretary General of Global Action, Dr. Kennedy Graham explains.
You will see that what we did there, with regard to global warming but also to deforestation, was to identify in the first paragraph global targets. That is to say, a 50% cut in the rate of global deforestation to further reduce CO2 emissions, and thirdly, global reforestation of 12 million hectares per annum to increase the planet's absorptive capacity of CO2. Then, in the next paragraph, what we did was go as far as we could at the time in getting into national contributions to that global target. It seems to us there's two ways of approaching the global problems. One is you look at the national interest and you say, well, this is going to do, and I hope very much that the planet's okay. The other alternative, which we are trying to promote, is to say these are the global problems, here is the global solution, the global target. Now what do we have to do as a nation to achieve that? We went as far as we could, but what we did do in that second part was the following. A 50% cut in the rate of global deforestation will be required, particularly of tropical countries, whose rainforest areas are of vital importance to the planet's environment. Developed countries will be expected to reduce net deforestation to zero. Now, we were hoping we could get as far as saying individual countries must do the following, but we were not able to get there. Perhaps the objective is to get there. And then each country should state what areas of reforestation it plans to undertake over the next 5 years with a view to achieving the global goal of 12 million hectares. It's an example of the approach we were trying to take, which I think meets the point. But the bottom line is which country is going to make the contribution as part of the strategic zone? Are all countries going to make an equal sacrifice, and from what common base?
2 years later, at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development at Rio de Janeiro in June 1992, what did the governments of the world produce? A rather limpid set of documents.
The documents that were signed were 3 non-binding documents, and I want to emphasize non-binding. The 3 of them were the Rio Declaration, which essentially was merely guiding principles on environment and development, very important in providing a direction as to how we pursue further economic enhancement in the future. Secondly was Agenda 21, which is not binding, but it certainly reflects the global consensus and the political commitment at the very highest levels of our respective governments. It also suggests various actions that could be taken to help prevent environmental degradation. And the third non-binding document, the forest principles, which we will later discuss this afternoon.
A young parliamentarian from Haiti, Gary Guiteau, offers support for the Rio process, despite the trials and tribulations in his own country.
But I'd like to add that we, as parliamentarians, are those who are best placed to promote the agenda of Rio. It is very unfortunate that in my country, in Haiti, after the anti-democratic coup that overthrew the elected president, elected by a majority of 67%, it is impossible for us to even enjoy the freedom of association, being meetings having been prohibited. However, I think that in my capacity as a parliamentarian, the agenda of Rio will still find support of the Haitian Parliament. Thank you very much.
But needless to say, here is an opportunity for us today to better define what particular principles we should be guided by and what specific actions can be taken.
The discussion turns thus to the question of developing certain principles on which legislation to combat global warming might rest. Legislation that would go considerably further than the climate change treaty signed at Rio currently requires of governments. Andres Palma of Chile.
Pero la afirmación que aquí se ha hecho de que
the affirmation that he who pollutes should pay is a very basic affirmation in any forum having to do with environment. The fundamental problem is that those who pollute do not know that they pollute. In our country, Santiago, the capital, has a grave pollution problem. Fundamentally resulting from automobiles. In the Parliament, we are debating a law to charge tariffs for automobiles used in the center of the city. And contrary to belief, the car users in our country ask us to promote this law because the problem of pollution has reached such a level that they feel that they will be benefited from money resulting from these tariffs. The situation has reached dramatic levels. The pollutants have assumed their responsibility. There should be consciousness of this at a global level.
Jose Soria Arc from Argentina agrees.
I would like to mention classical Rome, where it was determined with rigorous precision which were the rights and the obligations of the Roman citizens. One of these is precisely that in which each citizen should respond according to the damage which she inflicts. My colleague from Germany signaled with precision, he who pollutes pays. And in this sense, I would like this to be a universal principle, which is not a new principle, that it be ratified in a permanent fashion by this organization. We are not blaming countries, but assuming responsibilities, collective responsibilities, and particular ones. And in order to assume these responsibilities, more than money, diffusion of an environmental culture.
Dr. Eduardo Calmel del Solar of Peru.
We should look for a position in a political initiative which permits a legislation that highly contaminating countries, polluting countries should sign first, Japan, the United States. We should speak to the parliamentarians from those countries to talk to them about what they are doing, that they are destroying the world in a disproportion of 80-20. In comparison to the rest of the world.
But Dr. Tadatoshi Akiba from Japan takes issue.
Our friend from Peru grouped the United States and Japan together as bad polluters of the world. And certainly Japan is contributing toward pollution, but as far as the efficiency of energy use per capita, I think Japan has done a great job, and I certainly would like to give credit where it is due. And certainly it's in a different order from the United States. And I don't think that the two countries ought to be grouped together.
David Berger from Canada agrees. Energy efficiency is at the heart of the issue, but it is the private more than the public sector that will help solve the problem.
Well, I think we all know, of course, that it's not governments that will reduce the amount of energy and materials used per unit in the production of goods and services, but industry that will do so, perhaps with a bit of help or incentives from governments. But in today's economy, innovation is primarily science-based, and it is therefore very costly. And it would seem that business groups in certain countries are particularly successful at science-based innovation.
Based on these principles, the politicians explore the various policies that might be adopted by their countries in the name of the proclaimed planetary interest that is the hallmark of their organization. Mariana Granditz of Austria.
We passed a law after the Rio summit in Austria, and all the tropical timber products in Austria has to be marked by a sign, this is a product of tropical timber. It is, in the moment, a huge protest of the timber industry because they claim that is the end of the trade. Especially the pressure from Malaysia is very, very heavy to Austrian government, and we have a debate. But the law is already or has been passed. The next step is that we passed a recommendation to the government that the customs to such products should be increased to 70%. That's also very, very high. I know that Austria is a very small country, but it could be an example how to deal with that questions, especially because we use these tropical timber for our graves. People usually bury themselves in such timber.
Austria, in fact, was the first country to undertake such a forthright step. Following intense pressure from some of the timber exporting countries, the Parliament reversed the legislation. A new law along similar lines, however, is being prepared. The issue is both a delicate and complex one, as Gary Gibson of Australia explains.
I think this is another issue similar to the debate this morning where the developed countries of the world have to accept their own responsibility in this issue without placing enormous pressure on the developing countries and saying to them, you should be getting out of logging. You know, it's now your responsibility to look after the nation's rainforests or forests. when the developed countries like my own have cleared out all of our forests, and now we're saying to countries like my colleague from Indonesia or my colleague from Malaysia, well, you should stop now. We've done ours, but it's now your responsibility. So I think it's very important for us to accept the challenge as parliamentarians to look at what deliberate government policies we can undertake. We should be doing things in our own country to reduce the waste of timber and paper products. We should be doing a lot more to encourage recycling industries, to put government investment in recycling industries, to undertake research into improvement of recycling, and to encourage recycled products throughout wherever we can, particularly throughout the public service and the government by providing that leadership.
Sir David Steele of the United Kingdom offers a new idea from his own country.
They're looking at a pilot project in the south of Scotland, in my own constituency, is the development of biofuels. That is, using the surplus land which we are forcing farmers to give up because of the excess of food production in Europe for the development of alternative crops. The particular crop that they're looking at in my part of Scotland are willow trees. There is one commercial plant in Sweden, it's the only place where it's known to happen at the moment, where the farmers are encouraged to grow willow trees. They're harvested every third year with a special machine like a combine harvester which turns the wood into chips. These are fed into a special burner which produce gas, which in turn produce electricity. Now, it may be that this is one of the many areas where diversity in farming in the developed world could actually help by producing a new source of energy which is helpful to the world's climate.
The question of energy use evokes a broader philosophical comment about lifestyles in the North and the South, and the related question of the world's rapidly growing population. The Honourable Emma Bonino, Deputy Speaker in the Italian Parliament.
Well, I am Italian, the Vatican is just next door, so you can imagine that addressing the population issue was not a very simple task. But in fact, on the contrary, due to a sort of information campaign that connected with UNFPA, I was circulating documents on the growth of population, and apparently nobody knew, of my colleagues, the vastity of the problem. So finally, the agreement, that there was a general agreement exactly on addressing the population problem, both on correct family planning and on development, and economic and social development, particularly linked to the rights of women, the rights of school, the right of health care, etc., and particularly addressed to women. And I think this is a major achievement in my country, because you can imagine the sort of pressure, and it has been signed by the Christian Democrats and by the government majority.
I would like to underline the fact that one person in the US is using as much energy as 2 persons in Europe and 800 people in Nepal. So if we discuss the whole question of environmental problems and overpopulating the earth, we have to take in consideration that it is a major problem of the industrialized countries, that we are the main reason for the lack of energy, if I want to put it like that, and for all the things like CO2 and all the chemical problems concerning pollution and the ozone problem. So that, therefore, I would ask you to discuss, even on the parliamentary level, that we have to change our lifestyle. And if I say we, then I mean, first of all, the Northern Hemisphere.
Just to endorse generally the comments from Emma Bonino and the Austrian colleague on the complexity of the population issue. It is a major issue. This organisation should be involved in the debate about it leading up to the Cairo conference, but recognising that while it is the South that sees population soaring, the proportion of the world's resources consumed by each of the South citizens is such a small fraction of those consumed by the North citizens, and we have to keep that issue in perspective when we deal with the issue of population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
As politicians, the participants are conscious of the need to bring the people along with them, both in knowledge of the severity of the problem and a readiness to share in the responsibility and sacrifice, if necessary, for a common solution to what is a global problem. Teo Sambuaga of Indonesia.
The problem we face, and we try to come to the solution to save the forest, is the global heritage. It is not belong only to Indonesia or belong to one country or belong to the tropical area countries, but belong to us. It is the world heritage, and it is the responsibility for all of us who represent people from all over the world to save that area. We should work together, whether it comes from the south, from the tropical areas countries, or from the north, from the producing countries. But we should work together hand in hand in order to enable people now and the younger generation and the coming generation to make use of this planet for the more benefit for their own welfare.
Professor Mona Mekram Abaid of the Parliament of Egypt stresses the potential role of women in combating the problems of the planet's environment.
I insist on a participation, popular participation, as being one of the main aspects for any policy we would like to implement, but also on the important role that women can play. Nothing is being said enough when we speak about the importance of women, of educating women, and of making them participate in any developmental process. Education is important if we talk about population growth. Education of women is a necessity today. It is no more a luxury. And I believe that a lot of our budgets should be allotted to removing that very high ratio in many of the more developing countries, where 50, 60, and 70% of women are illiterate. How can we ever go forward in any implementation of any new policy to safeguard the environment, the earth, our planet, if we don't think about the gender aspect of this problem?
But involving the people will require effective information and education about the nature of the problem in the first place. Miguel Romero.
I would like to see the PGA immediately come up with films and programs for all the members of Congress and the public in general. So when you talk of maintaining the level of the industrial level to cut down pollution, when you talk of reforestation, the people, the public will know what we are talking about and the importance of the same.
Y por esto yo comparto lo que decía Miguel Romero de Filipinas.
I share Miguel Romero's vision. There should be more information on the destruction of the environment, the increments in temperature, which substances, when used, generate ozone depletion. The action of many citizens will prevent problems before governments and parliaments. But it is important to divulge information.
Whilst understanding the points made by our colleague from the Philippines, that in many countries a lack of awareness of the problem and a lack of information of the problem is something which should be addressed. That, on the other hand, in some other countries, perhaps we are faced with too much awareness about the problem, in the sense that people are faced with such a massive data on what is ahead of us in terms of doomsday scenarios, that they tend to opt for the short-term preferences and forget about the long-term interest because it's simply too complicated to tackle.
Global Action President Silvia Hernandez, senator from Mexico.
I have had the experience of putting some fora with citizens, and they ask myself, what can I do at home? How could I help with my children? It has to do with the individual action in this, not the whole national strategical sphere or the international one, which are other levels to take into account. But I think we should try to go into that space and sphere that is waiting us to do something.
And in our country, we are working now to get the environment awareness in the curriculum for the junior high school. That is, the education system will also adopt all the climate, the global change of climate awareness and its implications, so that the people, since the very beginning, could get the awareness of the environment's protection.
And I think that that is most admirable and is happening, I believe, in many countries. We've recognized the value of educating young children. But as we mentioned earlier, by the time those children are adults, we may not have the tropical rainforest, nor may we be able to deal with the health effects of the hole in the ozone layer. So there is this urgency about educating the decision makers and the policy makers and the business leaders who are in power to make the changes that are necessary. And the bottom line is not only that there is a sense of urgency for action, but those of us who have information must share that information rapidly, because after information, then comes the tangible tools, then comes the financing and the technology exchange. And very clearly, if we can all leave here later today or tomorrow and recognize that we are all in this together, then it is through working together that will be most effective, then I am confident that we will meet our mandate of moving in an urgent fashion.
This is where the question of international cooperation, North-South or East-West partnership would come in. Particularly if you think of the poor countries which are going to be the sufferers in case of a massive environmental degradation. I'd like to have your comments how we could organize funding, in particular, whether the developed countries who are contributing to this process in a big way, whether they're prepared to come up with funds, whether they're prepared to come up with expertise to help countries like ours. Thank you.
The question, of course, is the question of who will pay for the implementation of the environmental programs identified in Agenda 2. That issue has already been addressed. Environmental protection means incremental costs, which of course developing countries cannot afford to pay. The implementation of Agenda 21 has been estimated to cost $23 billion a year. Without adequate financial support, Agenda 21 will remain words on paper.
But there is a catch-22 here. The capacity of the North to pay for the damage to the South depends on their economic well-being. And ironically, their economic health depends on the very fossil fuels that are causing the damage. Australia's Gary Gibson replies to Dr. Khan and Minister Rashesha.
Because the Australian economy is a very strong resource-based economy with fairly heavy emphasis on agricultural and mineral sectors and particular coal production. We are the world's largest exporter of coal, and all our energy, almost all of our energy production within Australia is coal-based. Therefore, to have a major reduction in emissions of fossil fuels will have a major impact on the Australian economy. And although Australia is very much determined and has accepted and nationally has accepted the targets which were set at Toronto, we do place the caveat that we cannot move unless there is an international movement, that we can't go leading from the front because of the major impact on our own economy, but we are happy to move with the rest of the world, because we need to ensure that our economic basis is kept secure and is not subjected to major international forces.
Although people in my country are very concerned about the economy, one of the big disappointments is that they have not seen the peace dividend that was promised as a result of the end of the Cold War. And my colleague Mona from Egypt spoke in thanking the Secretary General about perhaps all of us targeting 1% of our military and defense budgets to peacekeeping. I think that Canada already contributes more than that. But I would also suggest that we could take, perhaps as a target, a percentage of our defense budgets and focus it on sustainable development.
But I also would like to respond to Mr. Khan and some other bringing up the idea of financing this, because there is no doubt whatever we have to do on the environmental side, it will cost enormous amount of money. And what I think should be done is to take up the idea from the UNDP, which has clearly showed up that they should divert funds from military to human needs. And they gave a very good example. And this I would like you to bring to your own parliaments and bring to the global actions activities and also in the UN. They say if you reduce by 3% the defense cost in your own countries, it will lead to a fund of between 1.2 to 1.5 trillion US dollar in the industrial countries, and approximately $279 billion in the developing countries. And that would help not only to develop, but also to use for the environmental purposes.
Though true, a little bit more complicated, because the reality is for every 3% in the reduction, for example, of the U.S. defense budget, that will mean that we will have 70,000 Americans unemployed. So that we would not have, I think it's important to mention that we would not just automatically have that bag of money to then give for other purposes. We would have to retrain and re-employ our own people. So it is more complex than that.
But you could also use the military, not least the military scientific area, which is already introduced by Sam Nunn and Al Gore in the Congress, and which is also facilitated $200 million US for that work from the Defense Department, the Energy Department, and EPA on the scientific side.
Terrific. Thank you for those recommendations. There is a great sense of urgency, and in many cases it is a situation where we know the answers. We know what can be done, but it is the spirit or the political will that is so very necessary, and the leadership. And part of what needs to happen is that sharing of information with those who may not know some of the positive actions that could be taken. I think we also have to recognize that we are beyond the time when we can be pointing fingers at one another and attributing blame, that we as leaders have to acknowledge that we are all in this together, and it is through our communal effort and our individual responsibilities in our own nations that we truly will be able to bring about the kind of changes that are so very necessary. And of course, the first change that is necessary is a cultural change on the way we do business, on the way we live. And that can only come about through education of the problem. And I am very confident that the people who have participated in this forum today have the leadership skills and the commitment and the political will to move our world toward a safer and better planet.
As you have seen, this dialogue is a first in which politicians from around the world who have been democratically elected are debating what amounts to the future of the planet. They will return to their national congresses and parliaments, determined to do what they can to protect the environment of the planet and yet maintain a sustainable development for each of their countries. What they say is not the last word on the subject. Indeed, in terms of the future self-governance of the world, it is just the beginning. Next, in the second of this two-part series, they will focus on keeping the peace.